So thank you everybody for attending. I know this is kind of the back half of the day and the afternoon session, so I know these days can get very long. So thank you for joining me this afternoon to talk a little bit about urban forestry and innovations in urban forestry. And what Davey is doing, I'm not really making this a sales pitchy thing. It's more about application rather than kind of the sales, to just kind of let everybody know some of the innovations that are in and around this space in terms of tree inventories, street tree inventories, park tree inventories, as well as urban tree canopy assessments. So maybe something that you all can take back to your communities, counties, whatever entities you're from, and maybe we can have further conversations around those moving forward. So just real quick, a little bit about myself. I do have both a master's and bachelor's in forestry, forest resource management. I've been in remote sensing for almost 16 years and about 14 years with Davey. And if for those of you who don't know Davey Tree, it's an environmental company that does a lot of work with asset management, vegetation management, and environmental consulting, do a lot of residential commercial tree work and stuff. So the resource group is essentially kind of an arm of the Davey Tree expert company. So we're more focused on project specific, kind of research, development, those types of things. So, and then I've also led hundreds of imagery analysis projects and LiDAR projects, and I'm also, as Bill had mentioned, just a certified geospatial professional and also a member of the ASPRS. So the agenda just got a couple quick topics for you all. Technology insights, so just kind of like what we're seeing in the market, kind of where the market's going in terms of just data. And it's probably outside the normal kind of data capture. Some of it's mobile, some of it's aerial. I got a few slides here to just kind of give more insights from the space front of everything. And smart tree inventories, what those are, how they're implemented, how you can operationalize them. Same for smart tree canopy assessments. So, and with that, I'll kind of wrap up with a few key takeaways from today. So first off, technology insights. I don't mention too much about manned aircraft or anything in this presentation because it's, we're looking at kind of more forward-looking technology. And the first one that I wanted to introduce is stereoscopic imagery. So stereoscopic is not a new thing per se, but from satellite, having high-resolution stereoscopic imagery that can be used to gather insights is becoming much more readily available. Airbus has the Pleiades NEO constellation, which is goes up to 30 centimeter resolution from satellite, and you're able to develop these high resolution kind of maps, 3D maps of the environment. So kind of replicating essentially what you would get with LiDAR analysis, not quite to the precision level, obviously, but that capability is out there. To be able to use that. There's a few other satellite constellations that also do this. Maxar certainly has one, but from kind of just our background in testing, we've found that the NEO constellation seems to work the best for our particular use case. And then I wanted to kind of introduce satellite LiDAR. Again, they do have some satellite LiDAR systems up there. There's some new technology that's being deployed here within the next couple of years. That's essentially going to satellite LiDAR the entire globe annually to produce DEMs, DSMs, and other applications for those. Really focusing more on evaluating Earth observation. So there is technology up there. It's going to have roughly about the I would say roughly around 2 points per square meter. So you're looking at different types of QL levels compared to just what we capture with aerial imagery. Since there are more passes, you can typically upgrade the quality level of the data, but this is just kind of a new revolution that we potentially might have more readily available access to LiDAR for our applications coming here within the next few years. And then I just wanted to mention hyperspectral imagery from satellite and space. So there's a company called Pixel that's introduced their constellation. They're currently collecting data in 10-meter resolution. There's a 30-meter resolution hyperspectral satellite that's already been orbiting for quite a while, but their plans are also to go down to roughly about 5-meter resolution. So we're not going quite tree-specific species, but you can start to get an understanding of species mapping or other types of mapping that you all are doing, from higher resolution hyperspectral imagery. So lots of cool new developments coming from that front. And then also, I think the following presentation here is going to talk a little bit more about drones, but I also wanted to introduce this because we do utilize drones in a lot of different ways for our projects. So, just thinking of like solar, utilities, environmental, wetland mapping, monitoring, any type of use case that you can think of, there certainly is going to be an application to where you can use drones. You just have to start to do those self-assessments on, what's the appropriate, square mileage or acreage or, per line miles for construction or anything like that to make that determination of, does it make sense to use drones or not? They're just another tool in the toolbox. But if you haven't thought about using them, there are quite a few use cases out there for them. We're even doing herbicide and seeding work with drones. So a lot of different things here from that perspective. And then just different types of work management software that's out there. Just wanted to kind of bring this to the attention. We always talk about data and high quality data, but there's a lot that you have to do with that data to operationalize it. And, work tracking, production, crew assignments, those types of things are all, kind of parts of implementing the data. We don't want that data to just sit or go to waste. We want to get that out there and make sure that everybody is having access to that information. So with that, I wanted to kind of just jump into the smart tree inventories and just kind of introduce like what these are and some of the new innovations around street tree mapping. So the common goal here is, from our standpoint, it's not necessarily to replace arborists with technology, but we do feel the arborists who don't use it are going to be more longer term, potentially behind the eight ball, if you will. And what we're trying to do here is get to the right decision on the right tree at the right time. So precise measurements and precise action when it comes to being able to implement, different types of pruning techniques or tree removals. So evaluating tree health and conditions and monitoring over time. So we feel that technology is going to be a huge, benefactor of how we manage urban forests and natural resources in general. So just to kind of take you back in the Wayback Machine, how traditional tree inventories were conducted. I think the first one on record was somewhere around the 1920s, 1930s, but all the way up until about the 1980s, it was mainly just pen and paper, just walking the street and recording things with a pen and paper, and then you started to use more digital technology, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, with just handheld devices, and then you start to go into more mobile applications. But today, with more of the 3D and the LiDAR and being able to have systems that can handle this data, now we're starting to talk more about digital twins and how digital twins can essentially help us recreate those real-world scenarios. So what is that, and how does that get captured? Well, it's a traditional mobile LiDAR scanning sensor, right? So you can capture photos as well as LiDAR data as a part of that. I think everybody's pretty familiar with how mobile LiDAR works and is captured. So not really much to talk about here on this slide, but did want to kind of just mention that, those are mobile sensors. There's also sensors that are able to be attached to different types of devices for park tree inventory. So thinking about off right-of-way or off highway management, road management areas and stuff like that. So you can still be able to capture those public spaces that are off of your, the road networks there. So, and what we're doing here is we're capturing a cinemetric accurate point cloud and automatically identifying each potential tree. And again, you guys are no strangers to seeing a point cloud, so not to belabor that point too much, but what we're essentially doing, or what can be done, I should say, is fusing that data, that point cloud data, with panoramic images, with multispectral images, so you're getting both the side and the overhead, and essentially with the time of the capture, you're creating this four-dimensional twin when you start to look at the time capture there, and being able to segment each tree, being able to segment the stems as the branches, and start to really evaluate how that tree is performing. So what does that look like in terms of analysis and data extraction? Well, I mean, we have the traditional, what's the species of the tree? What's the size of the tree in terms of DBH, diameter of the tree, height, ecological type information, leaf area index. A lot of these are indicators of how well a tree is performing. Economic value, what is the value of that tree bringing to the specific site that it's located at. Vitality, which is more about the health and the vigor of the tree itself. So those are very site-specific attributes that you can collect with this information. But there's also kind of adjacent things going on with that tree in terms of just clearance issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. Cohort analysis, which is basically comparing that tree of that species and that size and potential similar locations as to how well those are performing compared to each other, looking at age. And we can start to do different types of analysis as to which trees are actually overperforming or underperforming other like or similar trees of that species and size. And then also starting to look at leaning angles when we're looking at these species and trees in general to determine potential hazards. If you have a tree that's got like a 30-degree lean over a highway, that might be a big issue. There's going to be a lot greater, probability that tree could fall, damage somebody, or damage some property, or injure somebody. So leaning angle is also kind of one of those kind of more predictive, pieces that we take a look at. And then really, I think the common goal here is to just really change over time monitoring of how those trees are performing. So a lot of different data and a lot of different analysis that you can get out of those. So what does implementing a smart tree inventory look like? So I'm glad this actually played. Usually when I bring these up, they never just auto start. So what you can actually do is when you do the scans, you can start to segment that tree and kind of separate it from the surrounding information. So from the adjacent building or cars or, other obstructions or, fire hydrants and things like that you're going to get into that point cloud. So you can start to do those precise measurements based off of, the integration of these digital twins. So if you were looking to implement some type of program like this, typically what you're going to look at is a multi-year project. And it all really starts with kind of the first year when you're looking at initiating the first site scan of everything. So now you're starting to get all the data, you're getting all the initial measurements, and then you're going to incorporate that into whatever software you're looking to manage that information from, whether it be an ArcGIS or another proprietary software. You have that capability to be able to infuse that data, get those analysis and results. And then in year 2, you're looking to actually implement some of those things. Well, what did we find, in terms of just all these data analytics? Like, what did we find? Can we start to strategize? Can put our plan in place for how we're going to prioritize, our tree maintenance? And then once you start to come around to year 3, you're basically just repeating the scan again, so that you can start to perform in year 4 and year 5, those additional change assessments, metrics, how much growth that tree actually, have over time. So that's really kind of the performance of these. A lot of cases, at least 2 to 3 site scans are really good, but if you're looking at an actual monitoring program, this is a really good way to kind of keep up with everything that's out there. And just to kind of give you guys sense of, just industry standard, typically there will be a normal inventory, and then you might come back 10, 15, maybe even 20 years later. And you're basically paying the same price as you would for that long assessment to do these rescans every year and get updated data. So there's a lot of benefits to being able to monitor these in a different way using the LiDAR technology, and just the combination of just technology in general with software and data processing that we have out there. So I talked a little bit about this, within platforms, this is obviously proprietary, but just to kind of show you what the capabilities of it are, you have your digital twin over on the left, and then you have essentially the panoramic photo there from the street collection, and then you start to have your attribute tables and stuff. So you're looking at like different crown height measurements, first stem breaks, the bifurcation. And then potentially number of stems, leans, angles, and things like that you have in your data set. And then you can really start to even look at this tree without even going to the site itself. So I'm thinking of like larger cities, like maybe Charlotte could take you, an hour, maybe hour and a half or so to go from completely one side of town over to the other if you have a very traffic dense day. We talk to a lot of communities about those. So saving time to be able to go out to the field. I know a lot of arborists typically don't have a lot of field time because they're fielding calls or work orders or signing work. So this is very critical to time management as well as just kind of the data capturing and monitoring, but you could start to see really the health and the vitality of that tree, just from the point cloud itself. And then you also have a map of kind of just the overhead canopy, and then there's a lot of other things that you could do to just like click on those to bring up attribute windows and tables. And then I think this is a video here. Yes, so there's about a minute video here, but basically this is just kind of how it could look in a 3D map environment. You can open that up, you could start to see the imagery in and of itself. You have a different look angles, so you don't just have one angle, you have multiple angles there, and then you can start to open up some additional viewers. You can actually see the point cloud overlaid on the particular tree so that you can kind of turn those on and off to be able to give you more, just more visual information. And, a professional arborist could go in there and could probably start to get, a prescription put together. But you can also go in and monitor over time, in terms of like what I was mentioning about, how is that tree performing close to other trees of its similar size and nature, and you can make observations and things about that particular tree, just from there. So other things, just real quick, just road clearance, that's pretty standard, I think that you can get from mobile LiDAR point clouds. There's a lot of asset inspection companies and stuff out there that do those things. Traffic signs, the clearance there. Utility line clearance, it's another big thing. Especially in our industry, we're not only looking at municipal work, but also utility line work. And then also critical root zones, so kind of just understanding like where the distribution of the roots may be. For those who don't know, typically the roots will go out about as far as the drip edge of the crown of the tree. So you can start to forecast essentially where the roots may or may not be as a part of that tree structure. So with that, I wanted to kind of just jump into what are smart tree canopy assessments with the about 15 minutes that I have left. So what we doing with smart tree assessments, and Bill can certainly answer to these about when we're looking in the urban tree canopy assessment world, very similar to how tree inventories were conducted for many years. There wasn't really an innovation in that space, and tree canopy assessments are kind of the same way right now. So we're starting to rethink or reimagine or re-image, like, what does a tree canopy assessment do, and what are the metrics that we should be getting out of that? So, on the left, you kind of have a standard 2D mapping land cover, something everybody in this room is probably very familiar with. No surprise there. But what we're actually starting to do more of, and this is not completely new, but there's a lot of canopy segmentation or tree segmentation that you can do with LiDAR point clouds. Stereo imagery can also do this. Again, it's a little less accurate to do it with stereo imagery than it is a point cloud, but you can actually start to see the individualized trees, but not only on public property like you would with a tree inventory, but you also get the private property, as adverse to where tree inventories are just public property. So you're actually getting the best of both worlds here in terms of just what cities can manage, as opposed to what are other outreach techniques that you can get to private property landowners. So what can we actually do with this segmented three-dimensional data in and of itself? I realize these are two-dimensional layers that I have in here, but some of that is more you're going to look about the tree height. You're going to look at the tree health, especially with multiple scans over time. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But now we're actually starting to look at a full-scale management of like what a city or a county owns as compared to just what's potentially on public property. So now we're starting to get tree count estimates. And I say mature tree count estimates because these are optical sensors. You're not necessarily capturing everything that's above the top part of the canopy. There are stems in the intermediate and the lower levels of the canopy that you're missing, but these are really more of your dominant, more mature trees that we're getting. These are the ones that provide the benefits, the environmental benefits of shading, wildlife habitat, diversity, those types of things. So It really starts to give you more in-depth analysis about the structure of the overall urban forest itself. And then you could start to do a little bit about biomass as well, and that kind of leads me into this one, to where you can start to see your biomass for each individual tree. I have the dry weight up here as an example, but you could also use wet weight, but typically it's a little more than twice the weight, but just depends on the species of the tree. But what we're seeing here is, if you're thinking about potential ways to use or develop a wood utilization program, so taking the wood from those tree removals or prunes that the community is doing, potentially finding ways to reassess, how can we repurpose that information? Can we put it into mulch, which is usually the last priority, but can we do like a more kind of a more innovative technique, such as like biochar, and being able to use that information or use that wood waste and basically just reconvert it for another purpose. So this is a good way to start thinking about how much we could potentially have if we have to remove trees or a grouping of trees. Overall urban forest health monitoring. This is kind of one of the things that I was talking about just a second ago. So I think we're all aware of how imagery can provide different spectral responses and signatures, just at varying times of year. Also different types of precipitations. Maybe one year was drier versus a wetter year. So there's a lot of things that go into data capture that we have to kind of take note of. But what we're looking to try to do more so is kind of tease out some of those annual variances, is kind of like how we like to talk about them, and find out which ones had the major improvements versus which ones had the major declines. And for this example, if you could see down on the bottom here, these were newly planted street trees from the first time this was scanned. I think it was back in 2019. And then the second scan was in 2023. So typically when you plant a new tree, there is a very stressful environment. There's a lot of root establishment. That tree has to essentially build and harden itself to that site. So that tree, those groupings of trees had a significant health improvement over time compared to some of these maybe oranger and yellow, or the reds and the oranges there that are showing significant declines. And anything kind of in that like gray to yellow to light greenish color, those are what we're kind of considering as, there's not really much change there. There's not statistical change. We're not really measuring much there. There's some slight variances from year to year. But we have to understand that there are environmental issues and impacts that go with that in a lot of different ways. So as part of a traditional kind of canopy assessment, we've looked at a lot of like different, heat island mitigation techniques, those types of things. So having surface temperature maps are a good way to determine where there's more heat retention, or at least more heat exposure, during different times. This one was a day temperature map, but you could also look at evening temperatures or night temperatures as a part of that. But it's kind of like an expanded smart tree canopy assessment, is not only just looking at the surface temperatures, but what about the ambient air temperatures, and how does that flow about the environment, and how do trees manage, maybe they don't, maybe they do, but how do they manage to kind of keep some of those temperatures cooler? So we're talking about more microclimate conditions as we're looking at more heat island type analysis. And then another thing that we're looking at in terms of just places to plant trees is where's our hours of direct sunlight being located. So a lot of what this is more solar radiation models, as we're casting sun angles on three-dimensional surfaces, so that you can determine how many hours of sunlight is actually hitting at that particular spot. And this is really interesting, especially for cities, and streets and, public rights of way, because you can start to tell, like, maybe I need to put trees here to mitigate heat, or maybe I need to put trees by bus stops to cast more shade for, folks who might be waiting for the buses. So there's a lot of different applications for this. This was actually in a theme park, to where they wanted to know where they could add more trees for shade. So if you guys have been to any of those larger theme parks, there's a lot of open space, not a lot of shade. So, site planning and trying to implement those types of things into our heat island assessments is really critical about what a tree canopy assessment is going to tell us moving forward. Priority planting, this is kind of more of a smart, kind of thing when we're starting to look about, what data goes into these analyses and into these assessments. This is not new for anybody who's done a tree canopy study or conducted a priority planting analysis. This is kind of one of the holdovers, if you will. So we're taking essentially the grass and open space areas, bare soils, so looking at potential planting opportunities without having to go back and retrofit by removing sidewalks or parking lot or asphalt or anything like that. So basically these shovel-ready projects is what we're looking at in terms of priority planting. So what we're doing here is we're looking at a bunch of environmental features. So we're looking at like hardscapes, our impervious surfaces, our canopy fragmentation, where can we connect canopy corridors to increase biodiversity, where can we reduce those fragments, on the landscape, floodplains, for bank soil, stabilization and erosion prevention, those types of things, slopes, again, and then heat islands, kind of, focusing on that. Also equity, planting trees for equitable distribution across a community is also a very key form of how not only conducting the land cover analysis and determining where the spatial distribution of trees is, but where can we actually get new trees, and where can we plant those trees to help the residents of the community or the county, or even a state if you're doing a statewide level assessment. So a lot of different factors that really start to go into these things. Traditionally, you're going to be looking at like a weighted overlay model. Some of these you're prioritizing some data sets more than others, but it's still good to include certain types of data, even though it may not necessarily be a critical factor. You can still have it within your model to determine these planting areas. So what I'm saying is basically this is kind of the bread and butter baseline assessment, and then the previous analysis that I was just talking about with like solar radiation, biomass, like all these other things that are being incorporated can help certainly expand the knowledge and the reporting of what we're actually getting out of here. And then kind of bringing in social equity data, you're starting to look at per capita statistics, income statistics, property ownerships, all this other variables and factors that could really weigh heavily on, potentially how a community has or will in the future plant trees for different types of distribution. So another thing about a smart tree canopy assessment is, a lot of the times when we get, these inventories done through the smart tree inventory assessments, it's really great at picking out, hey, these are where our trees are, these are the size of the trees, these are the management problems that we would have with these trees, but where can I actually plant new trees? So implementing, essentially these two in kind of tandem will really help you kind of determine where your vacant sites or your open spaces are. So we've actually put a lot of work into developing these different types of, vacant site, planting site models, so to speak. So, if your goals are to plant street trees, you can start to identify with this super high resolution imagery. This is actually a near map image in the background. So you're looking at roughly that 7 to 10 centimeter imagery resolution once you're starting to really get down into the nitty gritty on these, so you can pick out those planting strips and areas. If you're looking to potentially plant on private property, or you're doing outreach for tree giveaways or whatever other programs that might be involved, you also have information on front yards, backyards, so property ownership of about potentially where we could actually plant those trees. So just kind of go through a couple slides here. Through our model, it identifies these planting spaces. And then what we start to do is implement, area elimination techniques. So you don't necessarily want to plant a new tree in the shadow of an old tree, because now that tree is going to have a lot of resource competition compared to that mature tree, and the chance of survivability is going to be a lot less. So we start to add area around those current trees. We also buffer around impervious surfaces, because you're not necessarily going to plant, or would want to plant, directly next to the sidewalk, because you're starting to think now, if I plant the tree next to the sidewalk, I'm going to have issues with that sidewalk down the road raising from the root growth of those trees. So really starting to think about how we're going to manage cities in a different way, and that's what this is getting to, is we're planting trees back from the edges of those driveways, of those sidewalks, of those other structures. Now this doesn't necessarily count like tree pits or wells, median plantings and things like that. There's some other techniques to implement trees for those particular purposes. So other things, you could start to talk about overhead and underground utilities, and you can also talk about intersections, keeping intersections clear, for safety, for obvious safety reasons. And essentially what you have is these remaining areas of kind of yellow in the map there that you have open for planting trees. And then the tree planting model essentially goes in and starts to determine, like, hey, these are vacant sites, and these are where we can plant these trees. Now, one development that we're really trying to get more so in is analyzing the actual width and length of those spaces, so that we can say, hey, here's a site, and we could say a small, medium, or large statured tree is applicable to plant in those locations. And then from there, you can actually start to get to site-specific species recommendations of, if you want to plant a large tree here, given your tree inventory or other information that you have of that location, we would recommend planting these 2 or 3, maybe 4 species. So now you're starting to get a diversification of, the trees that you're planting as a part of this process as well. So that's kind of where this is ultimately going, in the end is, we're taking this very high level canopy assessment data, and now we're actually operationalizing that to where we're getting detailed assessments and recommendations on tree species and size that you can plant in these particular open areas. And then I just got a couple more slides here to wrap up, but another one, if you guys haven't heard of this, is the 330-300 analysis. And this is just really another way to evaluate whether properties or buildings are having enough canopy coverage in and around them. So if you look at the map, I didn't separate these out by what passed, like either it passed the 3 trees, it passed the 30%, or it passed the 300. I didn't separate those out, but you can clearly see just by looking at this that you kind of have a void of trees or parks or canopy in this neighborhood here, some over here, some down here. So it's just a quick, I would say more of a quick evaluation tool more than anything else. I don't think there's really a lot of actionable results that come out of this, other than it's, you can very plainly see like where you need to plant, trees, or try to get more green infrastructure into those areas. So another cool little tool that can help evaluate, essentially the property and the landscape. Also talking about more predictive-based analysis when it comes to smart tree canopy assessment. So looking at those segmented canopies, starting to implement, these different vectors and scenario builds and prioritization. So talking maybe about cost-benefit models to removing a tree or keeping a tree, putting wind speed to that tree. Is it stable enough to handle a 50 or 60, 80 mile an hour wind? So you're starting to look at different kind of rankings or tree clustering kind of algorithms that predict, what's the likelihood of this tree potentially failing, which is kind of hard to do because even healthy trees can fail, quite frequently, given the right circumstances. So it's a very challenging thing, and one that we get asked all the time is, how do you predict tree failure? And the answer is, it's really hard. So a lot of these give you the tools to be able to to assess the probability. It doesn't mean that it is going to fail, but you can start to put some more educated, I'll say, guesstimations around which trees you want to start, kind of maybe updating the more maintenance, more frequency, or more even just think about removing in general. And then really kind of lastly here to wrap up, digital twins. This is actually from the Pleiades NEO constellation of a digital twin. This is in San Diego. So you can imagine the recreation of these models, these urban environments. And again, I know digital twins are nothing new for everybody in this room, but think about just creating this 3D immersive environment and overlaying all of that data, seeing the actual surface temperatures along all of this, and seeing the shading from the solar radiation models and different types of weather, weather predictors, and tree health, so draping those tree health rasters and stuff over this information. So it gives you a lot of really, really important information that can help manage urban forests. So we definitely see that this is kind of where the industry is taking urban tree canopy assessments. And not only are we doing tree canopy assessments, I'd say on average, 10 years ago, it was probably like the recommendation was, do a canopy assessment every 10 years. Now it's probably more so do one every 4 to 5 years. Typically, a lot of people will align these with the NAEP imagery collections. For those familiar with the NAEP imagery program, it's that leaf-on collection. I think they're going down to 30 centimeters in some states, but typically most of the time now they're 60 centimeter resolution. So high enough to produce a pretty good land cover layer. But now, with the readiness of satellite data, aerial imagery, different types of techniques out there, you might be able to do these like every year, every 2 years. I don't think you need to overkill it and do multiple times a year, but every couple years, certainly a plausible option. And I think that all stems from, just the willingness to have newer data, quicker data, refresh your data much quicker for faster decision making. And ultimately what that's going to do is help preserve trees and increase, citywide canopies or community canopies. So the last thing here is just kind of planning tools. I think I got a couple more minutes here, but just planning tools. So there's different applications, those variables and stuff. This is kind of where you build those scenarios to determine, priority planting areas. So this is a census level analysis, but you can overlay this information in GIS, determine all these different variable factors and stuff that you want to use, and start putting different weights to those things and get a dynamic symbolization of where you need to plant more trees in your community. So taking all that GIS data that we did from the analysis, getting it into a tool that's going to allow you to operationalize that and get that information out to whoever. Maybe it's the nonprofits that you're working with. Maybe it's the city government, city councils, whoever might be, even tree contractors. I guess you could share that information with them too. But so just more things to think about, and then just kind of predictive modeling. When setting, kind of average tree diameters and things like that. You can start to make some guesses on how many trees you need to plant to hit certain canopy goals. So if you wanted to increase your canopy from 30% to 32%, you can put in, a cost that it takes to plant a tree, the average size of the tree that you're going to plant, the distribution of large, medium, and small trees that you're looking at. Factors if you have a change analysis, so multiple periods of canopy levels. You can look to see how the overall trend of your urban forest is going. Is it going positive? Is it a no net loss? Or is it negative trending? And then also mortality rates of those planted trees. So you got a lot of different factors to play here to determine essentially, and I uploaded these slides to the website. So if you guys need to take a look at this, I realize these are probably hard to see from back there, but basically the whole goal of that analysis to get to a certain canopy percentage is, what is it going to take me to get there from the investment standpoint? How many years do I want to plan for? And, how many trees am I going to need to get there? So this particular model in general just assumes that you're planting trees to get to that goal, which is not the best way to get there. There's like natural regeneration, bare root seedlings. There's other methods and techniques other than just planting trees to increase canopy. The easiest way to increase tree canopy is to preserve the trees that you have, knowing that trees take decades to really reach their full potential. So a lot of really just key information that you can get from these planning tools. So really to wrap it up, with my final slide here, just some key takeaways. Boy, technology changes fast, and the way we analyze data and how quickly we can analyze data has changed in a variety of ways. I mean, we're going from pen and paper to mobile collections to now digital twins, collecting data much quicker, cheaper, different metrics. That one of the things that I didn't mention about traditional tree inventories is, there's multiple people kind of looking at those, right? So it's a bit subjective as to what one person would say is a priority maintenance issue or the health of that tree versus what somebody else would say. Typically they're very close, but there could be differences to where this digital data, you're looking more objectively about the data and you're just looking at the statistics that you're getting from the data. So there's not that, not to say that humans aren't capable of doing that, because we've been doing that for a while, but you reduce some of that subjectivity, from that human kind of bias component, if you will. And digital twins and 3D data, especially in urban forestry, we're not using them a ton right now. Smart tree inventories is kind of bringing those to the forefront. And also these smart UTC assessments are looking more at that 3D capability and visualization of data. And really just new metrics are being generated. What we thought was good 10 years ago certainly might not be now. So we're providing additional information, more data analysis, more machine learning, more deep learning capabilities to help our decision making. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's essentially what we're trying to get out of everything here. So. And then integrating multiple systems, data integrations, different platforms, being able to see data in multiple locations, 311 data, tree inventory data, ArcGIS, enterprise systems, all these need to have the capability to integrate and really just get the data out to as many people as possible. So with that, that's my takeaway, and I think I got a couple minutes, but are there any questions? Yes. Yes.
Great presentation. Well, I was curious about the point cloud and associated platform that you showed. Is that something that your firm creates, or is that a vendor that you source?
Yeah, so the question was, are we hosting those point clouds in our platform, or is that from the vendor? So right now we're partnering with a company called Greehill, and they're kind of storing that point cloud in their environment. But Davey has a proprietary software called Treekeeper, and we're integrating the 3D capabilities there, so it should be able to be stored in there as well. There's also other, you could actually host the point cloud in probably an Esri environment or whatever and integrate that into our systems as well. So that's kind of where the integration comes in.
Quick follow-up. The reason why I asked is if you foresee, as more cities undergoing these assessments, if you'd be willing to make that data either available publicly or accessible publicly, so that planners that have other use cases could have access to it.
Yeah, and that's also one thing that we're kind of talking about. It's not just arborists and vegetation managers that we're talking to. We're coming at this from like a more holistic standpoint for the community, that there are a lot of other things that you can get out of this data and a lot of other use cases for that as well. So thank you. Yes.
What to like incentivize more people to plant trees, right? Particularly on like private property. A lot of municipalities have like stormwater fees, right? Calculated based off this,
Yep.
percent of impervious surface on their parcel. But like trees intercept, rent, right?
Yes.
So if you're just calculating your stormwater fees based off of impervious surface, well, let's look at why don't we like flip that around and look at impervious coverage. And in fact, why couldn't we bring in data on like 3D structure of the tree, and maybe reduce your stormwater fees if you change your parcel from a lawn to
Right.
canopies and trees.
Yeah, and the question there was, just thinking about stormwater runoff and how trees kind of help manage some of that runoff, is how we flip like different types of land coverage and conversion. And that's one thing that we certainly talk about, in reducing stormwater management fees and things. A lot of communities these days are having those and implementing those stormwater fee programs and such. So we're trying to actively talk to residents, I should say, about increasing the greening, planting trees to help mitigate that runoff and capture that, because there's so much water that gets uptake by the leaves, the stems, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, so we do, and the question was, is that being modeled? Yes, we do that through a program called iTree that takes a look at the coverage of the canopy and looks at essentially like the volumetrics of the canopy and determines, and that program is Davey works on that program with the Forest Service to develop that, and we've recently just signed a new 10-year contract with them to keep improving those tools and providing those. And iTree software is free to use, so if you do have canopy coverage or canopy percent, you can understand the air quality benefits, the carbon storage benefits, the water mitigation benefits and stuff. So, yeah.
Real quick, could you explain the 330-300 rule for us?
Yes, so the 330-300 rule. This was developed in Eastern Europe, or I think it was in Europe somewhere. And what this is basically doing is it's kind of more of this greening or health metric for for residents. So if you stare out your window, can you see 3 trees? Are you living in a neighborhood or a census block group that has 30% canopy? And are you pretty much within walking distance, 300 meters? I think it's roughly about a quarter mile. Are you within 10 to 15 minutes of a park? And what that analysis was doing was showing the building locations, or essentially the parcels, that met those particular criteria. So evaluating that rule can certainly help a city determine, maybe we need more pocket parks. Maybe we do need to plant more trees, or maybe we just need to have this, cohesive conversation around just what are we going to take to get our community up to those different levels. So.